When we're born, we're an unspoiled blank canvas. The way in which we view the world is like an artist's canvas waiting to be painted. We're not born knowing how to behave. We're taught based on the lessons and examples that we learn from our parents. These create mental models in the brain, ways of understanding of how the world works. Let me share with you an example from my childhood. When I was at school, my parents told me to work hard. This was a value and a behaviour to be rewarded, because if I worked hard, I'd probably do all right. And I suspect that this is because when they were at school, they worked hard. And it was a way in which they understood the world and led them to achieve the things that they did. Put simply, you work hard, you're going to be successful, you do all right. As I grew up, this mental model was reinforced. I threw myself into everything that I did, putting in exceptional amounts of energy and effort into achieving the things that I wanted to do. I broke larger goals down into smaller practical chunks, and I made sure that I got them done. And this approach got me into university and into the Royal Marines as a commissioned officer. The model was continuously reinforced. But not every problem, not every challenge you come up against will be able to be solved using the things that you've learned in your history, in your past. Sometimes you have to challenge those mental models that you've learned. Sometimes you have to challenge whether the lessons that you've learned from your past will take you to where you want to go in the future. Let me share with you two very different experiences from the front line. In 2007, I led troops on the ground in Afghanistan. I was based in a place called Forward Operating Base Inkerman, about 6 miles north of Sangin in the Helmand Valley. When I arrived in theatre, the British military had been there for 5 years. And initially, the plan had been to deploy troops of about 30 men into platoon houses, small base locations in the towns and villages that were up and down the valley. And the mission was just to provide security for all the reconstruction efforts that we were going to do there. But within a couple of years, these troops found themselves surrounded by an extremely hostile enemy who were intent on killing them. And for many locations, the guys on the ground weren't able to actually leave the perimeter. They were just fighting based on where they were. In September of 2007, when I deployed to Afghanistan, that threat still existed, but we had more troops on the ground, so we were able to push out and patrol into the local area. Now, a patrol is basically a tactical walk. We'd go through an orders process which explained what we were going to do and why, and we go through various scenarios that we'd expect to encounter and build standard operating procedures so that when they occurred, we knew what we were going to do because we'd rehearsed it. And after a few weeks of patrolling in the local area and talking to the people, you start to develop a bit of a sixth sense. You start to develop a sense that we used to call the absence of the normal. And this was when you felt that something wasn't quite right. Something wasn't historically the same as it had been in all your other patrols. So, for example, some of the signs might be, where have all the women just disappeared to? Why are their children playing in that street? Why aren't they there now? They're normally there. Where have they gone? And why is that guy looking at us and ducking away and talking on his mobile phone? These were indications that something wasn't quite right. And these were the indications or the warning signs that you were about to be ambushed or attacked. It's difficult to explain what it's like, but I think that this sense of focus comes from when the world in which you live in is very, very simple. Now, on operations, a Marine is doing typically one of 6 things. He's eating, sleeping, preparing to fight, going out and fighting, he's on exercise, he's exercising, he's working out, or he's doing a sentry routine. And there's a simplicity to this routine that creates this space for focus. And it's that ability to be focused and truly present to the environment in which you're in that keeps us alive. And then it happens. You hear a crack in the distance, followed by a few zips as the first few lead wasps or bullets fly past your head. As you duck down looking for cover, those lead wasps build into an angry swarm, occasionally punctuated by the whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade. You're into the fight now, and for me, the feeling was never really one of fear. It was more a sense of relief. The tension's been broken. I've survived the first 30 seconds. I know what I'm going to do, and I'm probably going to survive the whole firefight. And the reason for this is, if you survive those opening shots, if the rounds, for example, hit you in the arms or the legs, it's going to hurt, but you're going to survive that. It's a non-critical part of the body. If you get shot in the chest, the bullet's going to end up in your body armor. It's probably going to hurt and ruin your day, but you will survive it. So I rationalized that if I didn't get shot in the neck or in the face in the opening 30 seconds, if I could find cover, start to work out where the enemy were, and prepare to launch a counterattack, I'd probably survive the whole thing. So what I'd done is effectively build a mental model for a firefight. And this is a way of rationalizing the risk so that I could walk out that front gate day in and day out and get the job done. But towards the end of our tour, things started to change. Every time the Taliban ambushed us and got into a firefight, they were getting beaten back. We were winning. So what do you do? What do you do when you're not winning? When things aren't going the way you want? When you're losing? You change the way that you play the game. And what the Taliban went through, and what I'm going to talk you through, is a process called double loop learning. Originally developed by Chris Argyris and Donald Shon, double loop learning involves challenging the assumptions and the mental models, the way in which you're thinking, that drive your behavior. The key here is to look at the outcome or the result. The Taliban, in this instance, weren't getting the result that they wanted. They weren't winning. So they couldn't defeat us by shooting at us, so they started to change the way they played the game. And what they started to do instead was plant improvised explosive devices, homemade bombs, and booby traps, because they believed that these could be far more effective than shooting at us. And by challenging the way in which they were fighting the war, they started to ramp up the number of casualties. And because of this change, IED casualties from homemade bombs and improvised explosives accounted for more than 52% of all British fatalities during the war in Afghanistan. When you test the underlying assumptions for why you're doing something, you can start to unpick the foundations for that behavior. You can start to unpick the foundations on which that behavior is based. To learn something new, sometimes you have to unlearn something old. Let me give you an example from when I went through training. So when I joined the Royal Marines in 2005, they start with the assumption that you haven't been taught to do anything to the exceptionally high standards that they have. So they take it right back to the very basics, and they teach you how to wash. Now, they don't tell you, they teach you. So what this involved was a man stood in front of a group of 30 men with a bar of soap being hosed down with a hose pipe, washing himself, while a sergeant talked us through the process he was going through, making sure he got behind his ears and he was as thorough as you need to be. Now, unfortunately, that memory is absolutely burned into my imagination, and I can't forget it. The Royal Marines take you back to the very basics. So they teach you how to do everything, starting with the simple things like washing and shaving. But they're also a true example of a learning organization. They take the lessons learned on the battlefield and take them back to Commando Training Center to teach new officers and recruits. So when I joined the forces in 2005, I was initially taught to shoot out to a range of 300 meters. Now, this is the standard point of aim, point of impact of a British Army assault rifle, okay? The weapon was designed following the Second World War, and the design was based on the average range that Allied soldiers were engaging the enemy, 300 meters. So we were tested on our ability to shoot to that distance and to a bit before, 100 meters, and to a bit after, 600 meters. We were tested on that every single year. But as I was going through training, the Iraq insurgency was in full swing. British and American troops were being ambushed at close quarters in an urban environment. The enemy didn't want to fight us in the open, where we could use our Cold War weapon systems. They wanted to fight us in the towns where we couldn't use them. So, for example, A tank isn't actually that good in a city or an urban environment. It struggles to maneuver its main gun, and if it fires that thing, it may level a city block, causing a large number of civilian casualties. From a defensive perspective, a tank is particularly susceptible from an insurgent who can get quite close to it using the cover of a ruined building and then launch an attack on the weakest part of a tank, which is the top part. In the urban environment, our troops weren't being engaged at 300 meters. We were being engaged at 10 to 30 meters, sometimes within the room, sometimes within a room no bigger than the one we're in now. The environment had changed, so we had to double loop learn. We had to relearn how to shoot. And the best way in which I can explain this to you is that when you're taught to shoot at range, you're taught to stand side on to the target. But the trouble with this is what it does is expose a part of your body that's unprotected by your body armor, the side. So one of the first things that you have to learn how to do is change the way you shoot. You have to learn how to shoot front-facing, which is a very different position. And the reason for this is if you go into a room front-facing and you get shot as you come in through that door, it's better to take a bullet in the chest that's protected than it is in the unprotected side. Tactics for how you fight in the urban environment that were traditionally reserved for specialist units started to filter down to the infantry. Speed became more important than accuracy because that first round counts. Why doesn't everyone go through this process then of double loop learning? Why doesn't everyone do it if it's so valuable? I think the main reason is that because going through this process is actually really hard work, and for a lot of people it's simply not necessary. War is the ultimate form of competition. If you don't adapt, if you don't change your behavior in line with what the enemy is doing, you'll pay for it with your life. When sportsmen lose, they'll go home disappointed. When Marines lose, they won't go home. Double loop learning in this environment is essential for your survival. But you don't have to look at such an extreme environment to understand how it can be applied. Many people, for example, struggle to lose weight. And the best way to do that is a combination of diet and exercise. But because I've given you two things there, diet and exercise, I've instantly created an assumption that the benefits are driven equally by both. And that's a false dichotomy. Weight loss is driven primarily by what you eat, rather than by what you do in the gym. I'm not saying that exercise doesn't have an impact, of course it does. But what you do in the kitchen is far more productive than what you do in the gym. So if you want to lose weight, you're probably better off hiring a chef than a personal trainer. Most businesses are built around the concept that people are motivated by money. Pay them a bonus for performance, and they'll perform. But if that were really true, if there was a really strong correlation there, Manchester City would win every game they play. They got the highest wage bill, so why aren't they winning the Premiership year in, year out? Executive pay, bankers' bonuses, it's the same thing. Research by an academic at Harvard, Boris Groysberg, has shown that the bonuses in the financial sector are often completely unrelated to performance. For double loop learning to take place, you need to have two elements. The first is self-awareness, which you can get from a combination of feedback and reflection. It's not an easy skill to develop. It's difficult to uncover your own blind spots. But if you can do it, you'll be able to focus truly on what it is you need to do based on your actual performance rather than your own perceived performance. But you can only do this, really, if you're able to divorce your personality away from your performance. If you wrap the two up together, any feedback you received on how you've performed, you'll attach to your personality, and you won't be able to resist your ego from attacking it. So you won't be able to get the message because your mind is in a defensive way of thinking. If you can take this, the second thing that you need to take is responsibility. You're responsible for the situation you find yourself in, whether it's positive or negative. The question is what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it that's different? Now you're in a position to start thinking about double loop learning. Start with the results. look at the things that you're not happy with and start to challenge the assumptions that are driving that behavior. The key here is to go to the result first. Work out what you're not happy with, because if you're not, you may want to consider double loop learning. You may want to challenge the assumptions that you have around weight loss or motivating people in business. It may be as complicated as fighting a war or even learning how to shoot. Change is hard. Most of us want to change, but we get stuck in the same loops and patterns of behavior, leading us to the same disappointing result. Double loop learning forces you to do something different. By challenging the mental models and assumptions that you're making, you can create an opportunity to change your behavior and get a result that you want. We all have an amazing capacity to learn, to evolve in accordance with our environment. And we can either use this to our advantage and to improve ourselves, or we can simply carry on doing the same thing and getting the same result that we've been getting. Over the next couple of days, I'd invite you to reflect on the gaps between what you want and what you're getting. Perhaps you're stuck in a single loop cycle. Maybe you need to consider double loop learning. Thank you.